Hi, everybody. We're about to get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Stuart Elliott. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Real Deal. Thanks for coming out to our last panel of the day. So it's boom time for development in New York City. We've talked during our other panels today about the market and what apartments are trading for. Now we're going to turn our attention to architecture and design with a great panel. There are no shortage of architecturally ambitious buildings rising in New York City today, which seems to be a continuation of the last boom market, and some of them were designed by the members of our panel today. Before I turn it over to our architectural critic, James Garner, to moderate, I'd like to introduce our panelists briefly. Raise your hand when I call your name. John Cetra, founder of Cetra Ruddy Real Estate Architecture. Gene Kaufman, principal of Gene Kaufman Architect. We have Paul Whalen, partner at Robert A.M. Stern. And Bjarke Engels of the Bjarke Engels Group. Please give him a hand, and I'm going to bring on our moderator now.
Can you hear me all right? I'll take that as a yes. All right. I just got in from Chicago, and I found, as I always find when I go to Chicago, that they have a culture for architecture that tends to be missing in New York. You got the impression there that you could ask anyone on the street where the nearest Louis Sullivan or Mies van der Rohe building was, and you'd get a coherent answer, and I'm not sure that that's the case here. And so I'm interested in asking the panelists how they feel New York City is, and they can be as tactful or as undiplomatic as they wish, how they find New York City is as a culture for building architecture, specifically residential architecture, in comparison with other places where they've built. Mr. Cetra, what would you say?
Well, I think the environment for architecture in New York City really changed after September 11th. And that, I think, was a very critical point where the discussion about buildings and architecture and how to create the memorial and the new center downtown, I think had a ripple effect that moved out into other aspects of design, planning, and so on and so forth. So I think that from that, I see clearly in my mind the point where suddenly there were more architects internationally working in New York on residential projects and commercial projects as well. And I think that trend suddenly opened up the door for, I think, better design, even from across the board. So it wasn't just that there were certain projects that were great, but I think the bar was elevated. It may have also corresponded with who we had at city planning during that time with Amanda Burton and the priorities and goals that she set for the city.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, Mr. Bissell, you've just come in from Amsterdam, as you told me a few moments ago. Do you find that although things are probably more congenial to architectural inventiveness these days than perhaps 10 years ago? That's right. Well, yeah, do you find that since you've worked in various countries now, do you find that it is easier to work in New York than in other parts of the world, or do you still find that architecture in New York City is that the culture somehow impedes the creation of inventive architecture?
Well, it always depends who you're working with, I guess, because it's the people that are driving the business always. And I have the impression that investors and developers here in New York have been fairly conservative until the early 2000s. And all of a sudden that started changing. It's not entirely clear why. Part of that is because sometimes they needed to convince city planning that they could do larger buildings, and in exchange they were offering a more exciting design, which meant more risk, new cuts in the bottom line, and so on. But that seemed to have been an incentive, and it's proven to be a good thing all around the world. I mean, we've been working in other cities. As soon as politicians step in and say, well, we need to give private investment incentives to do things beyond just the box, then they actually really do that. So there's been this conservative side, and then there's a culture in the U.S. that's inherently pragmatic, and when you try to really go beyond just the practical considerations, that you try to do architecture, which is always a little bit one step further, one added value, and the one thing that costs more, the one thing that might make it more difficult. That's been difficult to absorb with this Anglo-Saxon spirit. But I think overall, if you look at the cultural shifts in the early 2000s, you see the rise of Apple and this culture of design and of the importance of the experience that comes with it. Then that has translated into architecture. I think there's an excitement about these things. People want now a different experience from what was possible 10, 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Then this is a question which I'll put to anyone who feels he wishes to answer it. We can all agree that architecture has become more adventurous over the past 15 years, let's say, or 14 years in New York City. But in terms of the actual manufacture of it, does anyone feel it's gotten better or worse? There's more value engineering, or is it more or less as it has always been? Does anyone want to take a... You go ahead.
Well, I think that in terms of value engineering, that always seems to go on. And I think that it's also tied into construction costs. And I think where we have been in 2007, 2008, where costs started to escalate, I think that at that point we started to see a tightening of the budget because construction was getting, almost impossible to bear for the developer. Then after 2009, the tide turned, and I can say that the value engineering that went on in some of our projects was the total 180. Where it was like, what can we add to this to make it even better? And when we did Walker Tower, which is down the street, that project, we had many, many discussions with the developer about that sort of thing. What else can we do here? What else can we add? How can we make this building better? How can we improve the design? And that was an incredible, experience. And I think there are some other examples in our office where that happened. But then now I see as construction costs are again getting hitting stratospheric numbers, that again there's a hesitancy and maybe a little bit of pullback from spending some additional money.
Okay. Paul Whalen, do you agree with that?
Yes. Excuse me. I think that's right. I think the feeling that I get from several clients that we're working with in the city right now is that there's a huge amount of optimism as to what can be done. And we're not getting a lot of pushback right now on with value engineering. We're actually, almost all of our clients right now just want us to do the best. It's this notion that they really want to hear what else we can do. And so, of course, that's a great time for architects.
Sure.
But not all of our buildings are equally expensive either. We do rental buildings that are less expensive than condominiums, and we're in a building like that, you're always working with a budget. And for us, it's just a matter of getting, sort of communicating very clearly at the start of the project as to what are our tools going to be that we can use to do the best building we can for our client.
Okay. Mr. Kaufman, what do you feel?
Well, I think that we have more of a free hand now because the construction cost is a lower percentage of the total project development cost. You know, it's a bottom line game, and what's happened is land prices that were at the bottom of the market, even under $200 a square foot, they went to 3 and 4 and 5, and in many cases now you see $1,000 a square foot for land. So if an architect wants to propose something that before would have been a significant expense compared to the run-up in land prices, it's a drop in the bucket. The developer doesn't even want to take time to tell you no. He says, okay, come on, let's go. So I think we've had a much better situation. And I think architecture has become a way of helping sell that project when they have this very big built-in land cost.
Okay, thank you. Well, that leads me to ask a question that I've always wondered about. To what extent do all of you feel that great design actually affects the sale and the amount paid for a given unit? Because in New York City, it's obviously different with new condominiums, but there is such a desperate search for really anything that's halfway okay that I wonder if most of the people who, unless they're oligarchs or something like that, most of them are more concerned with the basic comforts than they are, or than they should be, with the actual beauty of the design.
But I think maybe I'm just gonna bump in here. Like the way you ask the question, you almost assume that great design is like this sort of cosmetic layer outside the bones of the building, and I think that's a misconception, because great design is when you take all of the ingredients, the program, you even, you work with the program trying to sort of optimize, sort of don't overspend in the places where you won't get added value, like really try to sort of reprioritize potentially the home. And then when all those ingredients come together, you get a building that expresses potentially something that is different, not as an added cost on top of a generic stack of units, but where what makes the building look different is that it performs differently. And I think in that sense, there is maybe something in the culture that when you look at the consultant team in the US, it's quite often broken down in so many different consultants. Quite often there's like a design architect, then there's like a local executive architect, then there's like a handful of like different engineering, building services. And it has an efficiency because like everybody can work like in parallel, but it also has less of an opportunity to harvest the potential for synergy. And when you're working with limited resources, it's really in the synergy that, where you have like a lot of things at play at the same time. And this sort of lobotomy where the connection between the floor plans and the envelope, it's almost like two different projects. You end up with an envelope where you spend a lot of money on some kind of composition, and then you have some floor plans that collide with whatever external architectural intent was imposed. And I think where great design can actually really contribute to the value of a building is where you find these synergies. I mean, we're doing a building for the Durst organization on West 57th Street, the so-called the Durst Pyramid, or the Court Scraper, as we've nicknamed it. Courtyard meets skyscraper. But essentially there, what makes the building look different is that we managed to wedge in a big communal outdoor space in the middle of a very dense development. The asymmetry that makes it look like a warped pyramid is so that light and air and view can actually reach the garden in the middle and all the units. And I definitely think that these differentiators, where it's not just like sort of a cosmetic finish that can be value engineered away because like the bones of the building will remain intact, but where it's really in the nature of the project, there you actually have a great value proposition.
Sure. Well, that of course is sometimes true, and ideally would always be true, but I have a suspicion that in many cases, at least in New York City, there is a divergence between, shall we say, the envelope and what's inside the envelope. Granted, that should not be, but it is the case. And so that leads me to wonder.
And I think in that case, you don't get much value for cosmetics.
Okay. So in other words, you don't feel that people will pay more for a flashy facade if there is no
they're buying the home.
Course.
And I think also people are not stupid. Like they can see if this is a silly upgrade of a standard product.
Okay.
So I mean, we experienced we're doing a project in the Bahamas.
Yeah.
Where there's each balcony has a pool, and instead of putting it on top as a bathtub, we managed to sort of lower the pool into the floor, so you step down into it, and that creates a facade that looks a little bit like a honeycomb because you have this sort of sagging of the water, and then the handrail actually becomes the like an inverse aquarium where the pool goes all the way up against the handrail. It's like like a 70-foot long sheet of acrylic aquarium glass.
Okay.
So in the end, like the building looks rather striking, but what makes it look striking is the fact that you have that quality. And there, at least, the clients claim that the building has basically sold itself. There was a piece in the New York Times, and based on that article, they sold 4 units, so they're breaking ground already this July. Okay. So I think in some cases, but I think architecture has to be the bones of the building, all the way out to the skin. It can't just be the skin.
Okay, thank you. Well, does anyone else have strong feelings on that? Gene?
Yeah, I think what Bjarke is saying is very true. And but there are examples in New York City where you can see quite a shift in the difference between the exterior and the interior. And I think those buildings may not have as much value. Now, the developers spend a lot of money on marketing and put the best spin forward in those projects, and they probably still make out better than otherwise. But I think it's because there is maybe sometimes a lack of a certain amount of sophistication. People are, there's so many elements that contribute to the decision making of whether one should buy an apartment in one building or another. So it's location, which is very, very important. It's the outside, it's the amenities, it's the layout, and how well that's all done and all put together. And so definitely there is a split in some of those buildings, and I think it's very unfortunate. But it's such when you see it all come together, and you can see the combination or the sort of organic quality between the interior layout and the exterior and the finishes and the amenities. Our projects get very, very high marks for all of those things because they're all put together in a way that complement one another. And there's a lot of brokers, I think, probably in the room that we deal with who, this is the feedback that we're getting. So I think it's very important to try to maintain the architect. The lead architect has to maintain the integrity and with all these disparate, consultants that we have, sometimes I feel like I'm leading an orchestra, not designing a building, and so there's a challenge in that. But then that also helps because you can bring together all this incredible talent and work with these incredible people to make something better.
Thank you. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, I just want to say part of the problem is also the nature of parcels in Manhattan. Sometimes you just have a parcel and it's going to be occupied to 100%. You start extruding it and you start trying to sculpt away, but there is no room for public space most of the time. Yeah. And so what we're really looking for is these opportunities, these new ideas about how to build the city that go against this very narrow-minded parcel building. And I think, Bjarke, you did a project at Yale with the students about this inhabited pedestrian bridge from Queens to Manhattan. That's the kind of thing you wonder, and that would be something different. You know, you'd have a different kind of public space. You'd have a different kind of circulation in there, moving around the city. We're thinking about Penn Station also. The process there is very weird. To Europeans, this is clearly a public stake. You know, you'd think, why don't we? And the Municipal Arts Society has done a great job at promoting this and getting architects to work on it. But you're wondering, you know, could we get this going on a broader basis, you know? And there's probably a dozen projects of this kind around New York, and they need to be shaken alive, I think. And I think it's going to happen over time.
Shaken alive because there would be more input from the public, or how would?
Well, they're kind of dormant because they're waiting for private initiative. You look at, for instance, the High Line, and it took private initiative to bring this to life, you know. And it's not quite clear to me. I mean, people are supposed to start a whole movement to get something like that going. Who has the time to do that? You know, you'd hope that there would be some politician or some political energy behind these kinds of things, and you wonder how you get that to happen.
I think that New York's always been a very commercial city, and a lot is just driven by commercialism in New York. And I think that probably between World War II and maybe 10 years ago, the residential market in New York was just so dull, and it was just completely commercial. And it was just basically about building boxes, and it partially was, I think, because there was so little competition. And suddenly, I just think that partially there's a lot of money in New York right now, but I also think there's just an increased awareness among the public about quality architecture. And in the end, in New York, there are a lot of properties that because of zoning, the shape is largely completely established by zoning, or almost completely established by zoning, and you do end up having to deal with this box. But you can break out of it by doing floor plans that have to do with an elevation, and having the whole thing work together as one big idea. We actually, I think that our best buildings are the ones where we've been able to completely control everything about the building, the section, the plans, the elevations, the massing. There are times when a developer thinks that there's an added value to having two names to a project where there's an architect and an interior architect. And I think that, and obviously as an architect, I don't love that situation. It bothers me, and I think that it's not just a matter of splitting the work. It could be interesting to work with somebody else. I mean, that's okay. But having a split between a box and then the serial inside the box is a little strange.
We just finished a project on Park and 24th recently where we did the interiors as well. And what we heard is that people bought units because they liked the interiors. And I think that to the extent we could carry the design through, that made a very, very big difference. And I think that architects are now getting more of those opportunities. And I think that one reason why is that developers are looking around and they see examples where the architecture and the design has been successful, where it's helped sell the project, it's made it more valuable. And developers are inherently extremely conservative, and they're made more so because there are many other hurdles they have to jump over. Everyone has to jump over. You have to get the lender to approve it, and the mezz lender, and the partner, and the private capital, and the rest of the capital stack. And all of these people, if anybody objects, they say, okay, we'll change that. And so to the extent that they can see a project that's made it through all of these hurdles, and it's been very successful, and I think some of the people up here and other people have been doing this in the last few years, that's given them a little bit of courage and really a level of ambition, because in the end, they're really out to maximize value. And I think the market now for design is, as far as I can tell, the best it's ever been, even if you look back before our time. And I think we can capitalize on it.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's a good introduction to my next question. I'm interested to know from each of you if there is some project that has recently been completed in New York or that is going up, other than one from your own firm, of course, that stands out in your mind as especially distinguished or worthy of note. I'll start with you.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the name of the project is. It's Park Avenue. It's this concrete shell that's going to be like unbelievably tall.
Oh yeah, 436 Park? Is
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Raphael Vignoli.
Yes. I think...
432, sorry.
Exactly.
Park.
I think it has a little bit of the sobriety that has made some of the best buildings in New York. You know, if you look at the Flatiron, it's like a pure product of the conditions shaping it.
Yeah.
If you look at like some of Gordon Bunshaft's building, like the Grace and its twin, you know, like the Lever House, the Seagram building, like these buildings that have like a genuine sort of a genuine idea, like an optimization, a refinement, a certain simplicity.
Sure.
And I think this like in situ cast concrete facade, where the members get slimmer and slimmer as the accumulated weight gets reduced as you go up. It's like really brilliant and really elegant. And I think compared to, because you know there is a little bit of a screaming match on that belt south of Central Park. I think it's really going to stand out as something that is like very elegant and where the bones of the building is actually the expression of the architecture.
Well, thank you. I agree with you, and I also find that interesting because, at least to superficial inspection, his aesthetic is very different from yours, right? You're more, to use perhaps a polemical term, more deconstructed than he is, all right? I don't know if you'd accept that term, but you know what I mean.
I think that would be, I think to call us deconstructivist would be absurd.
Okay, well, then I'll provisionally withdraw that. But you at least know that the look of your 57th Street.
We're Scandinavians.
Building. Pardon?
You know, I'm saying we're Scandinavians. You know, it's.
Okay. Right.
I think actually we strive always to do the simplest possible response to the given conditions.
Yeah.
But and quite often the conditions are complex, and I think if you look at in computer programming, they explain the term. Whereas in my mind, deconstructivism is about complication.
Right.
Whereas complexity, in computer terms, is the capacity to transmit the maximum amount of information with the minimum amount of data.
Okay.
So essentially, the fewer keystrokes you need to deliver a certain performance, the more complex it is. And I think in a way, what we strive to do is the fewer moves that still allows you to achieve what you want to achieve.
Sure.
The more complexity, and in the end, like the more interesting the architecture. So it's always about trying to achieve a certain goal as blatantly as possible. But I think maybe where we differ is like I think we spend quite a bit of time trying to find out what more could this building offer than just X amount of square feet of rentable area.
Okay, fair enough. Mr. Kaufman?
I quite like this building, the HL23 that Neil Denari did finished about 2 years ago on the High Line, because I think that the whole notion of the High Line brought a whole new sensibility to what could be designed, and the zoning here was less prescriptive. And here's a guy who's well known as an academic, had never done a building, and did something nobody else had really imagined. And I think a lot of good buildings have followed in its wake, and I think that's one reason why.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cetra?
56 Leonard.
Okay.
I think it's an incredible building. It's kind of the opposite, of Vignoli's building uptown. I wasn't sure I was going to like it as I saw the renderings of it, and so it's not so much the top of the building and its overall form even that I found fascinating. But I was downtown about a month and a half ago, and I walked by the building on the corner, and I stood there on the opposite corner, catty corner to it, and it's the most incredible building that I've seen. The way that you know, in New York, we are many times working between party walls. We have street wall requirements, you know, very sort of, we have buildings with bases and towers. And you stand there and you can imagine the cacophony will be going on in that building. It's kind of reflected on the exterior of the building. So I think even at the streetscape, it has an energy that very few buildings will have as a residential building as well. I think it's you know, it's introducing a new language into the streetscape, you know, where we have been, you know, we went in New York from buildings with high street walls to then plazas, and that was thought to be, you know, we had to change that. And buildings, towers on base, and then street walls again, maximum building heights and contextual zoning. And this building has none of that. There's none of that. And it's a tower, but it has a vitality that will be interesting to see how it will affect future thinking about urban design in New York.
Okay, well, thank you. Very interesting. Mr. Whalen, what do you think?
Thanks for bringing up the street level. I think that's something that's very important to us, and we try to spend a lot of time on the street levels of our buildings. But the building I want to bring up is not really about the street level. It's about just the overall quality of the building. It's the Seldorf building on 11th Avenue. I think it's a really I like buildings that feel like they're really New York buildings when they're in New York. I think there's lots of room for lots of ideas.
11th Avenue in which street?
In the 20s. 200, yeah. 200 11th Avenue. Okay. And I just think it's a building that feels like it's a New York building. There's a sense of how it grows out of the history of industrial buildings in New York, but it's saying something new at the same time. I think it's the idea that that you can have your car parked next to your apartment is amazing. And that's not necessary to make that building interesting, but I think it's an interesting plus. And but overall, I just think it's a building that it feels very elegant. Feels the scale is great for the Riverside, and it feels like it's New York.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Wiesel?
Yeah, I have ambivalent feelings about this building, but you know, if you ask yourself what else you could do than a glass curtain wall, then I think Frank Gehry's Beekman Tower is a kind of an interesting approach. So Frank Gehry's tower downtown, and so what he's been trying to do is to make it feel like a draped facade, and because there's inherently in all of these glass curtain walls there is a lack of scale and detail and warmth and the way they interact with the light. The high-performance glass that you always end up with has these ugly colors and reflections and so on, and we don't need that much transparency anyway. But so I think the way it lives in that location and the way it relates to the city, you have the feeling that that belongs there. I find it difficult to imagine a city without it right now.
Okay, thank you. Well, I had so much fun asking that question that I'm going to put you all on the spot by asking another question, perhaps even more undiplomatic. Is there some building that stands out for special dispraise or animosity on your part? Does anyone want to answer that? Okay.
I don't want to call out a specific building at all, but it's difficult to be an architect and do that. Sure. But I will say that when people build very tall glass buildings, that the glass becomes your material, and the glass needs to be great.
And the
glass needs to be great.
Yeah.
And you can't use thin glass that's going to, or I think it would be nice to not use thin glass that's going to oil can. It just makes the facade look like it's plastic.
Right.
And rather than getting this sort of sheath of sort of this crystalline purity that you might expect from a glass building, you get something that feels more plastic.
Right.
And I think that's a real shame.
Okay, thank you. Very good. Mr. Setra, you were going to say something?
There was a building that went up in Long Island City, and you know, I have family in Queens, lives in Queens, and I sometimes find myself on Queens Boulevard. And the thing that was always so fascinating when you went west on Queens Boulevard, you could see the skyline of New York from, from Regal Park. You could see the buildings there. I've never seen it happen before in New York where one building totally obliterated the view of this Manhattan skyline from that point. So that goes on the list for me of the worst building in New York.
Okay, all right. Any? Good.
Well, I think that one of the great things about the geography of New York and Manhattan in particular is with all of these buildings one up against the other, it's hard to be really bad because you're partly hidden, and that's a blessing and a curse. And I think that buildings that go up that initially seem quite bad end up becoming part of the landscape. Like, for instance, if you think about some buildings that went up on the Upper West Side with air rights that were so tall they changed the zoning. But in most cases, what happens is another very tall building comes in, another very tall building comes in, and somehow or other they just become part of the landscape. And I think that more than a lot of cities, which have buildings that stand out and seem kind of egregious, New York seems to manage to get over these buildings.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, I also think like the beauty of New York City is this raw accumulation of quite often like really mediocre architecture, like individually, but together it becomes like this like mountain of city. I actually live, so in that sense, like it's very forgiving.
Right.
Almost anything goes. But I live right next to the Leonard. I can see the construction site from my bedroom. It is an amazing building, and it will be an amazing building. There's also like some amazing spandrel details to be, and some quite cool transfer columns. I don't know if you know the pill shapes, but not so far from there. Like when I moved to Tribeca 4 years ago, there was a construction starting, and it looked pretty promising. Like some open floor plans. It's like just like an infill of the end of a site down by West Broadway, and then as it moved ahead, it sort of suddenly they closed up the open facades, and it became some kind of pastiche recreation of something that, because all of the Tribeca buildings, like the historical lofts, are amazing, and they have like all of the detailing, and like they have the ceiling heights and everything, and this one, it tries to look like this, but it's it's the cheap version, so you're not fooling anyone, and the ceiling heights are like really cramped, and like in the end, it's like the worst of both worlds in a way, like and I think it's not going to hurt at all. It doesn't matter, right. But it's just definitely a missed opportunity.
Okay, very interesting. Well, that leads me to another question before I open the floor to questions from the audience. One of the most prolific architects in New York City who passed away a few years ago, a friend of mine, Frank Williams, he made some like 20 or 30 buildings, okay? He told me on one occasion that the only way to determine the ultimate success of a building is to build it. And until you've built it, you can't know. The implication there being that it is certainly possible that that between the design phase and the actual realization, some disappointment might set in. Now, obviously, I'm sure that has never happened with anyone here, but would anyone like to address that possibility? Because it must be a clear and present issue for architects.
Well, they say you're not an architect until you're 40. And in fact, a lot of architects didn't do major buildings until they were 50 or more, like Louis Kahn. And it's quite difficult, I think, to develop as an architect, to try things out, and to have to live with them. It's that Frank Lloyd Wright quote about the doctor being able to bury his mistakes, and the architect only gets to plant vines. And so I think that's quite a difficult hurdle for people to get over, and hopefully you kind of learn on somebody else's time and under somebody else's name.
I see, very interesting.
I think that there are lots of ways actually for an architect to check things along the way. Okay. You do full-scale mock-ups, you check things as often as you can. It's all you can do.
Yeah.
I mean, in the end, you won't really see it until it's built. And I always find it, to me, the biggest, what I'm always interested in is seeing if the scale of the building is what I thought it would be like. Does it seem bigger or smaller than I thought it would be? And typically, if we do our job right and we're doing lots of models, we like to work three-dimensionally a lot. We do lots of models and full-scale mock-ups and really study the building, the scale of the building. I haven't seen any really big surprises.
Okay. Now that suggests from what you said before that you sometimes change not the grand strategy, but the tactics in mid-course. Does that happen?
Well, when you do what's great about a full-scale mock-up is you see things built by the people who are going to build it.
Yeah.
And sometimes they feel that they can't afford your detail, they need to do it another way, it's the only way they can do it. And then you work with them and you just say, well, often you have to make a decision. You have to say, if I don't want to do a fake version of what we were trying to achieve,
right, yeah.
Why don't we just forget that idea and come up with something that'll work with your system and that this client can afford. Okay. That's what allows you to do something like this. You don't end up with a big disaster at the end of the project.
Okay, before I open, did you have a further comment?
No, actually, it's a little bit this about the test of time. I was like, follow up on Gene's comment. I'm very excited that I'm turning 40 in October, so I can call myself an architect. But I was just in Kurdistan, North Iraq, which is like the cradle of human civilization.
Sure.
It's where they invented agriculture and architecture and writing and mathematics. But we went and saw a synagogue that was 2,750 years old. And it had been fully, and it was a ruin now, but it had actually been fully functional until 1948, at which point the state of Israel happens and all the Jews from the village moved there instead.
Oh, I see.
And then nobody was taking care of it anymore. And then it sort of falls into ruin in 60 years. Yeah. So I think the lesson is that architecture, any building can actually last forever, as long as it remains relevant to the people inhabiting it. And the second it is no longer relevant, it takes 60 years for something to collapse that had actually been standing there for 2,700 years.
Very interesting. Thank you. Thank you. All right, now I'd like to open the floor to a few questions. You, sir.
With a growing percentage of non-union construction, have you noticed any change in the quality of schedule?
Did you all hear that? I think the question was, now with the increase in non-union construction, have you found that has any effect, adverse or otherwise, on the building of...
I think it has. On the other hand, I think it's kind of an irreversible trend. I think that the bottom line being the main issue for a lot of projects, this whole notion of trying to do things for less money is going to accelerate, not decrease. So you're going to see more and more people trying to drive a bottom line with low-end construction.
So that sounds as though it would be to the detriment of architecture, right?
I think it's to the detriment, but I think that the comment was just made about trying to work with the forces at hand, and this is dumbed down principle that the building's only as good as the dumbest person who works on it, and that could be the guy who's doing the caulking. And I think that the notion that you could build a full-scale mock-up and test it and so on, you have to work with the people who are available there to do the work. And I think that if you do that successfully, you can make a great building despite the limitations.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
I want to add to that and say that I think we went through, again, a learning curve with non-union construction companies that really began again in the last, when construction prices spiked in 2007, 2008. That's when there was much more interest in non-union. However, at that time, probably the worst projects that we ever did were with non-union construction companies. And at one point I even said that I never want to work with another one again. But I didn't really have that choice. And I'm glad that I did continue to work on some projects with non-union construction companies because they were whole construction industry was going through a transition, I believe. And today, I think that the quality level of non-union construction companies is 2 or 3 times or more greater than what it was during that upturn. So I think now there's much more competition with non-union construction, and probably the pricing has gone up as well. Not as close, I think, to what the union projects are costing, but they've gone up because they the non-union companies have found a better way to do it, and they realize they need more money more of the fee for supervision and organization and quality control amongst the various subcontractors that they use.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll take one more question. You, ma'am.
Hi. I'm very curious to see what you see, maybe not as a trend, but what you would like to be working on in the next few years.
I'll take yes, Mr. Basin.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, if you could choose the work, we would definitely try to find situations where we can transgress any kind of rule. Because if you have an established rule and it's been active for 100 years, chances are that the same thing has been done over and over and over again. We're trying to make some progress. We're trying to diversify the city. You know, we're trying to break loose from these from some of the bad ideas that keep repeating, and we're also trying to find new ideas that work. And a lot of that has to do with the way people live in a city. You know, the room they have to move around in, the kinds of things they can do. The immense success of something like Central Park has to do with this incredible density around it, and then all of a sudden you break that open and you make that big green window, and people walk out into it. And it's an incredible sensation. You know, I live in this neighborhood next to it, and every time you make that transition, you know, almost through a portal into that open piece of nature, it's really credible because it's so big. There's something magical happening, and I think there's a lot of things that could happen. You know, you could have pedestrian bridges, you could have things happening on the waterfronts. There's some movement around Red Hook. You know, there are these cleanup projects, and I'm not sure whether the incentive is really there financially, but those are the areas that are really interesting because you get this view of Manhattan. There's also, I mean, all the waterfront areas around New York, and there's a lot of it, are underutilized. You know, they're underused. There's so much to do there, and I think to some extent, you know, something like the Metropolitan Museum is completely uninteresting for its location. You know, there's so much potential in this building, what it could do with the park and how it could negotiate the city against the park. These kinds of things. There's endless work to do, I think. The question is just how do you get to it?
Sure.
Maybe you have the answer to that.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to comment on this?
I think that New York has been so heavily controlled by zoning and zoning.
By what?
By zoning.
Okay.
And I think that what happens is that, as was just said a little earlier, is that it homogenizes buildings beneficially and to the detriment of innovation. And I think that there's been talk about trying to have a special exception for special design buildings. And I think that every architect would like to have a no rules or minimal rules kind of opportunity. And then other people have to be the judge whether or not it makes sense or it doesn't. But I think any of us would love to have that. And then a second answer to your question is in 2 words is Penn Station, which I think is, you know, the saddest thing that's happened in our urban history, and happens to be, thank you, I believe it's the busiest building in the world, or non-building, let's say. And I think that, you know, that's 2 reasons why something has to happen there that makes sense for us.
Okay, thank you.
I
Mr.
just
Whalen, last word.
It's interesting hearing about wanting to transgress and do new things. I think that that's important, but sometimes we think that one of our roles is to make sure that we maintain the best qualities of New York as we move forward, and that it doesn't become a city full of buildings that maybe could be anywhere, but that we just remember that certain essential qualities to New York can move forward and we can reinvent, but at the same time we shouldn't forget what makes New York great, whether it's at a detailed level, at the scale of a street or the scale of a neighborhood.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the speakers and the audience. Bye.
Penn Station is